So, on to compositing. Now, next week we will talk a bit about what compositing is and good practice, but for this week, let's just get set up. So the first thing you need to do is to download Fusion 9. Now, the reason we are using this is that it's a professional level compositing program that's free and node-based. Now, is it as good as Nuke? It's close, but no. But is Nuke £4,000 better than a free Fusion 9? Not in my opinion, at least. And the skills are transferable if you want to move to Nuke later. So Fusion has since been incorporated into what is now DaVinci Resolve. DaVinci Resolve is a great program for editing and grading, and it's also free, at least for the simple version. But the incorporation of Fusion makes it very difficult to use, hence why we're still using Fusion 9, which was the last free standalone version before it became part of Resolve. Okay, so with that cleared up, let's download Fusion 9. So to find the installer, we just need to go to the support page on the Blackmagic Design website. And if we search for Fusion, up here, if we just hit Ctrl F and just search for Fusion 9, we'll see that on the latest download section here, on the 30th of July 2018, we have access to Fusion 9 and we can download it for Windows or Mac. Okay, so what we will cover this week is a brief overview of the interface, and we will create a slap comp, which is just a term for quickly throwing together the render layers just to see what we have. Okay, so let's jump into Fusion. So the three main windows here are the flow view, the viewer, or we have two views here, and the tools menu. And this is where it displays the parameters of the node that you have active in the flow view. At the top we have the standard menus, and we will go into these a bit later when we need to. Below that we have some layout presets, so we can change the organization of the windows. And we can of course make our own if we wish. To the right of this we have the most common nodes used within Fusion. You can of course customize these, and you can script your own if you want. At the bottom we have the timeline, and we have options here to enter the overall start and end frames. And within this, the working frame, so we can just reduce this if we want. To the right, of course, we have the pause and play options. We have this render button that we will come back to. And further right of this, we have some settings that allow us to optimize what we see in the viewport for playback purposes. So we can disable or enable the high quality, the motion blur, or enable some proxy settings, or render only part of what we see in the viewport. Okay, so that covers the basics of just what we see here. Let's drop down a node. So if we want to bring in an image, for instance, we have a few ways of doing this. We can drag and drop it in. Let me just navigate to this. So we can just drag and drop this guy in. If this was part of an image sequence, if we had rendered out the entire sequence here, when we drag and drop this in, it will automatically bring in all the frames within the sequence in this folder. If we only want one, then we would hold in Shift whilst we drag this in. And the fact that on its parameters we have 0 to 0, and the fact that this line is blue indicates that it is a single image and not an image sequence. Okay, so another way to bring this in is we could, up the top here, grab this loader button and drag it down. That creates a loader and also allows us to navigate to the image that we like. Finally, we can control and space, which brings up this select tool menu, very similar to what we see in Houdini. After which we can type in the node we want, so say loader, and then press OK, and it does the same thing. So let me just delete some of these guys. So to see this in the viewport, we can drag and drop this in, and it just pops up here. One thing you'll notice is that the color space hasn't been set up yet. So let's do this now. Let me just make this a bit bigger. To zoom out of any image or any space, it's middle click and left click at the same time. It is a bit awkward at first, but you get used to it pretty quickly. So middle click to pan, middle click and left mouse button to zoom. Okay, so let's set up this color space then within the viewport and within the flow. The first thing we need to do is enable the LUT. Now nothing switches on obviously because we haven't set this up. We just click the little arrow here and choose OCIO color space view LUT. Now it is enabled, but we haven't plugged anything in. So if we open this back up and go to edit whilst this is active, we can now navigate to the OCIO. So we are looking for the config.ocio. It should be within the ACES folder, whether you have a newer version or an older one. And of course, we want to change this from ACES CG, because that is what we rendered in, to the sRGB, which is the monitor space. So let me just click this here. Nice, so this should now match the render that you had in Houdini. Now, this is only applied to the viewport. We can switch this on and off. But if we want to bake this into the image, then we also have an OCI node that we can use. So again, that was Control Space to bring up that menu, and OCIO, and we'll find the color space. It has the same options here, so we just have to do the same thing. ACES CG, and output sRGB. So now if we plug this in and drag and drop this into the viewport, we get the double transform, but we can disable it from the viewport, and now it is baked in to the image. So we will talk a little bit about some of these settings later, but for now let's bring in our Atmos using another file. So let me just bring in a loader and navigate to the Atmos. Now, I have mistakenly rendered in the sky, but it's not a problem for me at the moment. I can always remove it. And we have a few ways of combining these together. So if we look at the node, you can see there is a blue arrow, and the blue arrow is almost always the mask. So you can see if we hover over this, it tells us what it does. On the right, we have this red box, and this is the output. So one way of combining these together is we can drag this guy onto this one, and it pops out a merge node. On the node itself, we also have these little white dots. So this just indicates what viewer it is active in. So if I switch to the double view again, like we had before, I can disable it from this view and enable it in this view. Cool. So let me just switch back to this one. Within the merge node, we now have this orange arrow and this green arrow. So this is background and this is foreground. And we can switch between these by pressing Ctrl and T, and that just flicks between what is the background and what is the foreground. And let me drag this up into the viewport. Cool. So now we have some volume here. And we also have the blue arrow. So we can mask on the foreground in certain areas using a black and white mask. On the merge node, we also have the apply mode, and you should be familiar with these if you've ever used Photoshop or any other compositing program. And we can choose which one we want it to be, so for instance screen. And a bit further down, we can also choose how much we have on the render. Cool, so now we have brought in the Atmos, let's bring in the volume. I'll just copy and paste these guys. And if I want to drop this into the flow, I just hold in Shift and that will drop it in. If I want to drop the whole thing, if I hold in Shift, I can do the same. And this time I'll find the fog. Nice. So now we have the Atmos and we have the fog. Okay, so finally, what we want to do is to save this out. So the proper way to render out any image sequence is using a saver. So you can see it here. Let me just drag this down and pick a place for it to go. I'll just choose a random place for now. Call it test. And plug this into here. So this is a saver node, and we can choose the output format. If you want to work on it more, then a TIFF or a target is fine. Just switch it to TIFF for now. And we can press the render button with this selected. And now we have some options to play with. Now, if we have final selected, it won't allow you to change any of these. It will just render out the final quality image. And you can, of course, change the frame range. But if you wanted to, say, render out a lower quality image, just so you can test some stuff, if you go into preview, then you can enable or disable the high quality, the motion blur, or just the render region. You can change the size, or you can input your own down here. After which you would hit start render and it would just run through your frames. Now, if it is a sequence that you are rendering out, if you add a little underscore after the file name, it will then go ahead and add some numbers after this. Nice. So if it's just a single frame, then perhaps you just want to save this out. Now before I do this, let's drop down a color correct. You also notice that each node has a shorthand that you can use to quickly navigate to it within this select tool menu. In this case, CC takes you to color correct. So let me just drop this in and I'll boost up the contrast. It's very sensitive, so something small is fine. And also the gain. Okay, so this is a quick slap comp, and if I just want to save this out, I'll right click, save image, and just find somewhere to save it. Now, of course, if I only had this color space transform visible in the viewport and not in the flow, and save the image, it would not save in the color space transform. So I need to make sure it's within the flow. Nice. Finally, if we want to disable this color correct just to see what it looks like without it, we can use Control P. That just disables the node. Cool, so I'm happy with this. I would just drag this up here, right click, save image, choose a location. And that works for a quick slap comp. So this has been a quick introduction to Fusion, and of course next week we will go in depth into masks and different types of masks, 3D workspaces, etc, etc. Okay, so this week for the assignment, what we want you to do is to finish up your scattering and your texturing and make sure you're happy with the final render, bring in the volumetrics and create your atmospherics, download Fusion and set up a quick slap comp. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys do. Thanks.